Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for paying close attention in this case throughout the guilt phase, throughout every proceeding in this case. We know it's been difficult, a very, very serious set of circumstances, very serious case to deal with. And we respect your work and your consideration in this case and your obligations to follow the law. This is the most consequential decisions that you're going to have to deal with in this case. You should know that you will be instructed in this case, at the end of this case, that at no time do you ever have to, or are you going to be compelled to render a verdict for the death penalty. You're going to hear testimony that will last for a couple of days. But now we're at the phase where you have rendered a verdict in this case, and we're dealing obviously with the first degree murder counts, the 2 counts. And simply put, having found Mr. Colley guilty of those 2 charges, we now have to decide, you now have to decide what to do with Mr. Colley as far as the appropriate sentence in this case. You have always, in this case, throughout this penalty phase, throughout your deliberations, the legal opportunity to render a verdict of life in prison. Now, this process, as the judge has already told you about, is a different process than as you went through with what we in our vernacular call the guilt phase, where you were required to render a unanimous verdict in order for there to be a verdict in this case. And you've done that with counts 1 and 2, the first degree murder cases. However, in this process, and at the end of this case, you get your own vote. You get your own individual determination as to what the appropriate sentence in this case. And we're going to get into more detail about this and as part of the closing argument in this case, and go over the evidence with you and talk about the law that His Honor will instruct you on. But always keep that in mind throughout these proceedings, that you are entitled to hold on to your own decision about the appropriate sentence in this case, and that will be life in prison without the possibility of parole. And I'll discuss with you at the end of this case the significance of that. In other words, Mr. Colley, if that's the sentence that you impose, will leave prison in a pine box. There'll be a number of things that weigh in his favor in determining life without the possibility of parole. First, keep in mind that, as His Honor has already outlined for you and will also instruct you at the end of this case, the state is limited as to what they can present and argue in favor of the death penalty. Those are the aggravating factors that Ms. Dutton outlined for you, which you must consider or will consider and give whatever weight you decide to give and determine for yourself if those factors have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That will be your individual call on that. But the state is limited to those aggravating circumstances. However, that's not true with the defense. We're going to present to you what are called mitigating circumstances, things that we will argue to you and show you weigh in Mr. Colley's favor in supporting a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And those factors can be limitless. There may be things, and actually I will argue to you and talk to you at the end of this case, some of the things that you already have heard in the guilt phase about how this happened and some of the things that led up to the tragic events of August the 27th of 2015. There are set of laws too, or instructions that you needed that the judge has already outlined for you, which is contrary to aggravating factors, which have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. We never have to prove our mitigating circumstances any more than what we call the greater weight of the evidence. So 51%. More likely than not, these circumstances have been proven. So our burden on that is much less, far less than what the state's burden is on proving their aggravating circumstances. And mitigating circumstances can be things that we'll talk about as far as how this happened, some of the things you've already heard about, the difficulties that were going on prior to the homicides. But you're going to be introduced to a number of folks that know Mr. Colley very well and will speak very highly of him. He is, after all, a human being. Mr. Colley is 38 years old. He has 2 minor children that you heard, I think, a tad bit during the guilt phase. His son, Trey, we'll hear more about him, and his daughter, Avery. Mr. Colley was born in Illinois, in Elgin, Illinois. Came to Florida as a child with his family. You probably have figured out because Crystal Colley and Rhonda Colley testified he has 2 sisters. So you've already seen his 2 sisters, and we're going to have a great deal of more testimony about family background from testimony from Crystal. JR, as we call him, is the youngest of the 3. That when he moved from Illinois, he came to Florida. He went to school in his younger years in Orange Park. Eventually, his family moved to Volusia County. He actually graduated from Seabreeze High School in 1999 in Volusia County. You're going to hear from co-workers and other folks that Mr. Colley's been a very good employee, a very loyal employee, that he helped mentor other fellow employees. Mr. Colley, for the last 12 or so years, has been in the banking mortgage industry, and you'll hear a great deal about that testimony. You'll hear that he's been obviously gainfully employed for a long period of time. We'll get into more information about that for your consideration. That he did charitable work while he was in employment. You already heard, I believe, through the guilt phase indirectly, that Mr. Colley worked at Citibank at the time of this incident and had been working there for a number of years, again in the mortgage department. That he is very close to his family. He has living his mother and father. His mother is Judy Colley. His father is severely disabled. We call him JT, but it's James Colley Sr. Both of those folks live in Ormond Beach. You'll hear about how he's doing, Mr. Colley's doing, since he's been incarcerated in September 2015. And, he's been pretty good about adjusting to everything, and in his incarceration, he's actually taking courses on becoming a paralegal. You're going to hear that. You hear a lot of information from various folks that Mr. Colley adored his children, adores his children, was very active in their upbringing, played with them, did things with them, took them on vacations, a whole host of things. You'll see some pictures, actually, that will cover this issue as well. Mr. Colley not only adored his own 2 children, but he was also very involved in his neighbors' children, kids in the neighborhood, just adored him and played with him, and he was constantly active with them. You're going to hear that Mr. Colley was a race car enthusiast. He had his own race car. He was involved in that. He was very active in coaching football and baseball with his kids and with other kids certainly in the community as well. That you'll hear of Mr. Colley certainly is not a perfect person. You're going to hear testimony through experts and from his sister that Mr. Colley is a binge drinker, has been for a long time. That oftentimes when he drinks, he keeps drinking. You'll be allowed to consider that in weighing the mitigation in this case. You're going to hear testimony that when on certain occasions, not often, but he has done cocaine. Matter of fact, the night this all happened, he did a couple of lines of cocaine with another friend earlier in the morning, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. That at the time of this incident, that in fact he was substantially impaired at the time of the shootings. And let me kind of go into that a little bit. You're going to hear more about what happened in this case from some sources, some expert witnesses. Basically, the day before, the evening before all this happened, on the 26th of August of 2015, Mr. Colley, as you know, was staying with his sister Rhonda. Rhonda was in Italy at the time with her husband on vacation, but Mr. Colley was staying at Rhonda's house. So too were Mr. Colley's parents, and also a woman by the name of Tammy Folsom, who was a housekeeper, a good friend of the family, was there. Mr. Colley, as he's done a million times, his children were there. He was playing, taking care of his children. Children go to bed. As I say, his parents were there. Mr. Colley then makes arrangements and goes and meets with a friend over in Orange Park and has several drinks there in Orange Park. And that on a couple of occasions in the early morning hours of that, now we're into the 27th, he did a couple of lines of cocaine with his friends. He's away from the children. He's over in Orange Park. As you know, we've already talked about Rhonda Colley's house was on Garrison Drive. So that happens. Then he leaves his friend. You already know the circumstances of him about 4 o'clock in the morning, going to his wife's house, going inside, discovering the items that were discussed in the guilt phase, had contact with Mike Dickens, had another beer, and then goes home. What you're also going to hear, give me just 1 second, I apologize. What happens when lawyers talk too much. What then happens, what you should know, is at the time that this all happened, the day this all happened, Mr. Colley was on a number of medications. At the time, he was being treated for depression and had been taking a medication called Wellbutrin. But about 2 weeks before this happened, his doctor switched medication, had him go on Cymbalta to deal again with the depression. That was about 2 weeks before this happened. Also at the same time, about 2 weeks before these tragic events, because of some sleep problems that Mr. Colley was taking, he was prescribed Ambien. And he took it as needed, not every day. But when he gets home from Mike Dickens, he knows he has to go to court in the morning. He's been up all night. He takes 2 half tabs of his prescribed Ambien, and then tries to get some sleep. He's woken up a couple hours later by his father, who again is there at the house. So he has to go to court, gets up, goes to court, and then you know the events that unfold. What's going to be significant that we'll show you is the effects of the Ambien that are well documented, and you'll hear expert testimony on this, that you're going to hear the word parasomnia, which is that the Ambien is known to, and did in this particular case, cause Mr. Colley not to remember and not to be able to perceive and deal with, from a mental health perspective, the things that were going on that morning, including court, and the events as they unfolded in this case. We're going to have for your consideration 3 experts, 2 of which are going to specifically deal with the medication issue. You're going to hear today Mark Mills, who's a psychiatrist from Chevy Chase, Maryland, who has evaluated personally Mr. Colley, is an expert in psychiatry. He's going to talk to you about the issues of Ambien and the other medication he's on, which actually, too, I failed to mention that Mr. Colley, because of some severe back problems, back then he was on a number of pain medications, oxycodone, Mobit, Flexeril, and the like. And so there's going to be some discussions about those medications as well, too. But he's going to testify based on the series of events and some very particular mental health issues that Mr. Colley was substantially impaired at the time of the shooting. And that will be for your consideration. We'll be calling, you'll see him tomorrow morning, Dr. Daniel Buffington, who's an expert clinical pharmacologist who is going to get more in depth about the various medications that Mr. Colley was on and the effects of Ambien, the known adverse side effects with regard specifically to Ambien that he had taken that morning. So these are things that we're going to be getting into as well. You're also going to hear from a 3rd expert, I believe by the end of today, Michelle Quiroga, who's a neuropsychologist from down south in Coral Gables, who's going to talk about other aspects about Mr. Colley's mental health, that he obviously had been suffering from depression. He had issues of anxiety, that she's going to talk about his chronic alcohol abuse and the issues with regard to his abuse of cocaine and some other factors as well, too. So that will be before you for your consideration. You're also going to hear, unfortunately, some testimony from Crystal that when Mr. Colley was a child, he witnessed his mother take a baseball bat to his father in his presence. You'll hear that on another occasion, that his mom put a knife to his father's throat, again as a child. And that Mr. Colley was subjected to witnessing domestic violence in the house. These will be amongst many things that you'll hear, and we'll talk about at the end of this case the significant mitigation that you're going to hear. But we'll also ask you to keep an open mind and understand that at no time will you ever be compelled under the law to render a sentence of death. We're, on the other hand, going to be asking you to individually determine that the appropriate sentence in this case is life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you.